Sometimes life backs you into a corner and you can see no way of escape. I can think of a variety of people who might feel that way. Take, for example, the young couple. Before they got married, they talked about the fact that they were eager to be parents. They loved children. They wanted to have several of them, and they didn't want to wait too long before they began. They got married, deeply in love, happy to face the future together, and then they faced infertility. They tried everything possible. Prayer chains at the church. They went the route of all that medical science could offer them, and they just had no result. They were hemmed in, no way of escape, backed into a corner. I think of that couple. Or I think of the enterprising entrepreneur who was excited to get her business started. She had been dreaming about this since college days. She finally got out of college, got the capital together, got the business plan in place. Everything was ready to go. But before she opened, she invited her pastor to come over to her place of business to dedicate the space. She wanted this not to be just her dream, but she wanted this to be something that was blessed by God. And then she opened, and things went really well until something called COVID-19 hit. And that just kicked the props out from under her. Her plan was in a shambles. Financial picture was dismal. Where to go? Would she survive? She was hemmed in, nowhere to turn, backed into a corner. I think of her. Or I think of the older couple. They had been dreaming about retirement for some years. They had been very careful to follow a retirement plan so that all would be ready. They would have enough money not just to live, but to take a nice vacation here and there, be able to travel a bit. They had been very careful, very thoughtful, very prayerful as they planned for retirement. And then just about the time retirement was to begin, those persistent symptoms would not go away. He finally listened to his wife, went to the doctor. Tests were run. They came back positive. And suddenly this couple that had planned for so many years was hemmed in, no way out, backed into a corner. I even think of the dental student who invested. Oh, he invested in his education. Dental school is not cheap. He took out the loans. He studied hard. He did well. When he graduated, he found a practice that he could buy into and later buy. And then, COVID-19. No patients for weeks, several months, in fact. Everything was a disaster. Would he survive? He felt hemmed in, no way out, backed into a corner. Have you been there? Are you there right now? It's been for those kinds of reasons that we've been in this sermon series. This is the fifth of 5-part sermon series entitled simply, When? When life doesn't turn out the way it should, then what? And today we looked at those who are backed into a corner. Well, if you're there, if you've been there, if you can relate to our friends we just discussed, just know that you're not alone. Israel, the children of Israel, were backed into a corner, hemmed in, no way of escape. The context is pretty simple, though quite dramatic. The context comes at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. The 10 plagues have fallen. Pharaoh has finally yielded, at least for the moment, and allowed the people to leave the land. It's not long thereafter that they have that experience of being backed into a corner. So I want to read to you what it was that they experienced in Exodus chapter 14. I begin reading in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think, The Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready, took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The children of Israel are angry. They're blaming Moses. They're not just murmuring against him, they're almost yelling against him. "Why have you brought us out here? We are now caught between the devil and the deep blue sea," to quote the late, great Cab Calloway. We're caught between two options, neither of which is good. The sea is before us, the Egyptians behind us, the desert around us, the mountains block us in. Where are we supposed to go, Moses? We're backed into a corner. Now here's what's particularly galling about this, what's particularly difficult. They didn't need to be there. They did not need to be backed into this corner. There was a much more direct route from Egypt to the land of promise. So we have to ask the question, just why are they here? How did they get crammed into this corner from which there seemed to be no escape? Well, the truth is, God had everything to do with it. So having seen them now backed into that corner, I want to back up just a few verses and ask the question, what got them here in the first place? So let's go back now and read from the previous chapter right toward the end of the chapter, Exodus 13, starting with verse 17. Here's what the record says. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones with you up from this place. That's a disturbing passage. If you've paid careful attention to what it said, you no doubt are saying, wait a minute. God backed them into the corner? God got them there? Well, that's what the passage says. I want to talk to someone who's worshiping today with us, who's backed into a corner. I don't know. You may be that infertile couple. You may be that enterprising entrepreneur. You may be that senior citizen retiring couple. You may even be that young dentist wondering how to survive. But somebody here has been backed into a corner. If you have been backed into a corner and see no way of escape, I want to share with you 3 things from this passage. 3 things. Here's the first one. With God, often, the straightest line is a zigzag. With God, often, the straightest line is a zigzag. I've drawn those words from Donald Sanukian. I'm going to read from Dr. Sanukian in a moment. But let me first of all point out what the passage says. Remember, this is the first part of verse 17 of Exodus 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. There was a much more direct, I'll even call it a fairly straight route from Egypt to the land of promise. If you can picture it in your mind, you can see the Mediterranean Sea. You're down here in Egypt in the south. You're heading north by northwest a bit, just along the boundaries, the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, straight to the promised land. It's days, maybe 2 or 3 weeks at most. Straight route. That's the way to go. And yet, that's exactly where they're not going. Instead of heading northwest, they're heading southwest in the opposite direction. God, what in the world is going on? What are you doing? So now the words that I mentioned from Donald Sanukian. Listen to what Dr. Sanukian writes. Early in geometry we learned, says Sanukian, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But sometimes, as we look at what God is doing in our lives, we wonder if He doesn't think that the shortest distance between 2 points is a zigzag. We find ourselves at some point A, and though we believe God intends to take us to point B, we seem instead to be headed in the opposite direction, as though on a zigzag path. I want us to see, says Sanukian, that sometimes with God, the shortest distance between 2 points is a zigzag. Thank you, Donald Sanukian, for helping me think that through, for being influential as I read this passage, studied it. How true, how right that is. Have you noticed that in your own life? Let's say that the destination that you want to reach, the destination that God wants you to reach is character. To be a person of character. That's your destination. Now, the straightest point from where you are to character would be for God to give you the gift of character, like He gives you the gift of righteousness, covering you in the righteousness of Jesus. That's a straight line. God doesn't do that. You've discovered that, haven't you? Instead, here's what God does. He walks with you, guiding you, leading you through temptation, through failure, through repentance, through humility, through confession, through truth-telling, through reconciliation, through all kinds of character-building experiences that zigzag all over the place in your life. And you're thinking, God, just take me straight to character. And instead, God is off zigzagging through the wilderness. Because with God, often, the shortest distance between 2 points is a zigzag. Or take patience. Let's take patience as another example. Let's say that you believe that God wants you to be a person of patience. I want to be a person of patience. Come on, God, give me patience. You know what happens, don't you? In an instant world, does God give you patience now? Not on your life. It's not a straight line. In fact, I want to read you some words from an article in the Boston Globe back in 2013, so 7-8 years ago. Now, as we read this, just think to yourself how much more quickly the world has gone in the direction that the article underlines. It's an article talking about the fact that people have increasingly had a very difficult time in an instant world with waiting, being patient. Here's the article. Retailers are jumping into same-day delivery services. Whew, that disappeared in the rearview mirror. We're very much there right now. Smartphone apps eliminate the wait for a cab, a date, or a table at a hot restaurant. Movies and TV shows begin streaming in seconds. But experts caution that instant gratification comes at a price. It's making us less patient. We've come to expect things so quickly that researchers found people can't wait more than a few seconds for a video to load. One researcher examined the viewing habits of 6.7 million internet users. It's a pretty good sample. How long were these subjects willing to be patient? 2 seconds. After that, they started abandoning the site. After 5 seconds, the abandonment rate is 25%. When you get 10 seconds, half are gone. The results offer a glimpse into the future. As internet speeds increase, people will be even less willing to wait for that cute puppy video. The researcher, who spent years developing the study, listen to this, worries someday people will be too impatient to conduct studies on patience. Too impatient to conduct studies on patience. I want it right now. Straight line. And God says, hang on to your chariot. Slow the horses down. Because often with me, a straight line is a zigzag. You're backed into a corner. You want out of there. God, get me there. From Egypt to the promised land, God says, I will. But batten down the hatches. It's going to be a while. So if you're backed into that corner, that's the first thing I would want you to know. Often with God, the straightest line is a zigzag. But there's a second thing I would want you to know. A second reality that emerges from this passage. And that is this. With God, your zigzags are not done alone. God is with you. While you're zigzagging, God has not forgotten you. So let's go back to Exodus 13 and reread a verse in this passage. It's verse 19. Notice what it says. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So as Moses and the children of Israel leave Egypt, they're carrying a coffin with bones. The bones of Joseph. Joseph. There's someone who knew something about zigzags. He knew what it was to zigzag all over the place. He knew the reality of being a favored son and then sold as a slave and beat up and then landing in Egypt and bought as a slave and then being falsely accused and landing in a dungeon and then elevated to the highest office in the land except for Pharaoh. He knew zigzags all over the place. And yet, as he came later in his journey, he was able to look back over the journey he had taken, all the zigzags of his life, and he was able to say, you meant it to me for evil. But God meant it. God used it for good. While you're zigzagging, God has not forgotten you. Thus it was that Moses and the children of Israel wrapped up and took with them the bones of this figure, this man who had said, God will come to your aid. He will rescue you. He will save you. And so they gathered up his bones, and as a testimony, as a witness, they carried those bones with them to the land of promise. In your zigzagging, God has not forgotten you. I was caught by an incident, a story, a scene really, told by the preacher and author Tim Keller. He told of what apparently they do in the UK, in Britain, shepherds do with their rams, with their sheep. There comes a point every year, once or twice a year, when they have to take every ram, every sheep, every lamb, and they have to dip them in a trough filled with a certain kind of solution. It is a terrifying experience for the rams, for the sheep, because the shepherd has to dip them all the way into the trough and submerge them completely. Ears, eyes, nose, everything. As you can imagine, they're fighting to escape. But it's not just the shepherd who is trying to hold them down. The sheepdogs are there as well, perched all around the vat, barking in rage, trying to keep the sheep in the vat. If the shepherd doesn't do this, that ram, that sheep, will likely succumb to parasites and other diseases. It is necessary for the health and the well-being of the sheep. Now, while Keller is telling that incident, he then writes this. One Christian writer witnessing this process couldn't help but remember that Jesus is called our Good Shepherd and that we are his sheep. She wrote, says Keller, I've had some experiences in my life which have made me feel very sympathetic to those poor rams. I couldn't figure out any reason for the treatment I was getting from the shepherd I trusted. And he didn't give me a hint of explanation. As I watched the struggling sheep, I thought, if only there were some way to explain. In other words, if she could tell the sheep why this was happening. But such knowledge is too wonderful for them. It is high, and then she quotes from Psalm 139, they cannot attain to it. And then Keller closes with these words, we too have a good shepherd who is committed to his sheep, though he often does things that frighten us and that we cannot at the moment understand. He's still our good shepherd. He's still with us. Have you been to those places? Places where you feel backed into a corner, hemmed in, no place of escape, what to do next? And then you recognize it was the shepherd that got me here. I'm not in this space because I was disobedient. I'm in this space because I obeyed, because I followed. Because rather than heading northwest in a straight line, I followed the Spirit in a zigzag in a southwesterly direction. And now I'm in this situation and I'm wondering, Shepherd, what are you doing to me? Well, if it's true that often with God, the straightest line is a zigzag, it is also true that when we zigzag, God has not forgotten us. God is with us. We carry the bones of Joseph as a testimony that God will fulfill his word, that God will complete his promise. So if you're backed into that corner, I want you to know both of those things. That with God, often the straightest line is a zigzag, and when we zigzag, God has not forgotten us. But I would also like you to know a third reality from this passage. If you're backed into that corner, consider this reality. When we zigzag, God has his purposes. When we're zigzagging and getting backed into the corners, God has his purposes. Back to Exodus 13. Reread those first two verses we read, 17 and 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. So he didn't go the straight route. He went another route, but he had a reason for doing that. He said, I'm concerned. They may be marching out in battle array. They may think they're ready for battle, but they most definitely are not. And if they get into that situation, they may become so overwhelmed, so discouraged, that they will go back to their former life. God had His purposes. I read you the words of an author, a writer named Larry Libby. Listen to what Libby describes. Bob, he says, my father-in-law, hunts deer every fall in the mountains of north central California. A number of farmers and ranchers in the area are willing to let individuals or small groups hunt on their property if the hunters ask permission and show some respect for the land. My father-in-law is one of the most congenial men I've ever met. It would take a surpassingly cranky landowner to turn him down. Last year, he approached a rancher and asked him if he might drive through a certain gate and do some hunting in the evening. When shadows lengthen and the October sun slips low in the west, deer begin to venture forth from their hiding places to graze. The rancher gave Bob a thoughtful look and said, "Yeah, you can come on the land, but you'd better let me ride with you in the truck for a while. I want to show you some things." Now, I can imagine, says Libby, I can imagine some men thinking, "Oh, come on, show me some things? Why do I need a passenger? Either let me in or tell me to stay out. I know how to drive and I know how to hunt. I'm a big boy. I don't need a chaperone." Bob, however, being the man he is, cheerfully assented, and the pair drove through the gate onto the ranch. They had been skimming across a wide, seemingly featureless field when the rancher suddenly said, "You'd better start slowing down." Why? Had he seen a deer? Bob pulled his foot off the accelerator. But why stop? As far as he could see, there were no creeks, gullies, or fences, just a wide pasture stretching out to the dusky foothills. "Okay," said the rancher, you'd better park right here. I want to show you something." Bob did as he was told. They got out of the truck in the cool mountain air and began walking. Then the rancher put his hand on Bob's shoulder and said, "Look up ahead." My father-in-law walked slowly forward and then stopped dead in his tracks. Cleaving at right angles across their path and across the pasture as far as he could see in both directions was a yawning black tear in the surface of the earth. Where they stood, that crack was probably 30 feet across. Peering over the edge, the hair on Bob's neck bristled. Where was the bottom? The sheer rock-ribbed sides of the great volcanic fissure plunged to unknown depths. Cold, still air seemed to exhale from the blackness below. Walking back to the truck, Bob marveled at how difficult it was to see the fissure from just yards away. Bob smiled to himself. Having a guide wasn't such a bad thing. He gained a new appreciation for a man who knew the terrain and where to park the truck. Well, God's purposes, God's ways in your life, His reasons, may not be as dramatic as a seemingly bottomless fissure in the surface of the earth. But God has His reasons for the zigzags. Now, if you look at Scripture, if you read the narrative of God's people, you will find different reasons in different lives. For example, you will find that God is more interested in character than He is in speed. Just ask Moses, the Moses of this story, about that. Moses is called to deliver the children of Israel from Egypt. Moses says, "Great, I'll do it." There's a straight line to that. He goes out, he takes things into his own hands, he kills an Egyptian, he says, "All right, I've got this under control." And what happens? Disaster. Flees, and then spends 40 years following sheep around in the wilderness. God is much more interested in character than He is in speed. And in some lives, those are His purposes. You take a zigzag route because He's honing, He's refining, He's developing your character for something greater on the other side. Just ask Moses. So maybe those are His purposes, His ways in your life. Or look into another life, and you will find out that maybe the ways of God are that God needs to work on us so that He can then work through us. He needs to work on us so that He can then work through us. You see that in many lives in Scripture. Paul in the Arabian desert for years. Elijah. I've been rereading my Bible this year, and just this last week was reading a story I love, the story of Elijah. And it struck me yet again that Elijah spent an awful lot of time sitting doing nothing, apparently, and only a very little time doing the great dramatic events of his life. And in all those times that he waited, God is working on him, like a master craftsman. Like a whittler with a piece of wood, God is working on him so that then He can work through him. That's what happens in the zigzags of Elijah's life. There are different reasons, different ways. But in your zigzags, God has His purposes. Now, the purpose given here, as we've already seen, is that God says, as He looks at His people, He says, they're not ready. They are not mature enough yet for what lies ahead of them if they take the straight road. Not ready yet. Any parent, certainly any wise parent, can understand that. The parent who always says yes is not the good, wise parent. The good, wise parent is the parent that also and frequently says no. You're not ready for that yet. You got to take a slower road. I suppose it's for that reason that I was caught this week when I read it. Maybe I had read it before but didn't remember it. When I read these words from the pen of Ellen White, Signs of the Times, she writes, "The conflicts of earth in the providence of God furnish the very training necessary to develop characters fit for the courts of heaven. Our God is an ever-present help in every time of need. He is perfectly acquainted with the most secret thoughts of the heart, with all the intents and purposes of our souls. When we are in great perplexity," in parentheses, when we're backed into a corner, "even before we open to Him our distress, He is making arrangements for our deliverance. Our sorrow is not unnoticed. He always knows much better than we do just what is necessary for the good of His children, and He leads us as we would choose to be led if we could discern our own hearts and see our necessities and perils, that fissure in the earth, as God sees them. But finite beings seldom know themselves. They do not understand their own weaknesses, and when reproof comes and cautions are given, when they are rebuked or even advised, they think that they are misjudged and unjustly treated. God knows them better than they know themselves, and He understands how to lead them. But when He undertakes to guide them in ways which seem mysterious to them because of their blindness and lack of faith, they rebel and bring upon themselves unnecessary grief and trouble. They have prayed to the Lord for light and guidance, and the Lord answered them as He did Jacob. And like Jacob, they do not discern that it is the hand of the Lord leading them in a way contrary to their own choosing. If we will trust Him and commit our ways to Him, He will direct our steps in the very path that will result in our obtaining the victory over every evil passion and every trait of character that is unlike the character of our divine pattern." It's a bit lengthy, but what a powerful statement. I don't know how you would, if somebody says, "Would you summarize this for me?" I don't know how you would do that. I know how I would do it. I would do it by saying, in all our zigzags, God has His purposes. We're in a difficult time. It's challenging on every hand. We have the state of the economy. We have the state of what's going on in the health world with COVID-19. We have difficulties and challenges from injustice. There are challenges on every hand. And what we want to say is we want to say, God, please take us on a straight route, the straightest line necessary, the straightest line possible from our Egypt to your promised land. I'm so thankful that Donald Sanukian was the first one to get me to thinking along these lines. That what happened here with the people of Israel could be summarized, or I would summarize them in 3 ways. With God, as Sanukian said, the straightest line is often a zigzag. But when we're zigzagging, God has not forgotten us. He will come to our aid, because in all the zigzags of our life, God has His purposes. So if you're backed into a corner today, you're longing for deliverance, don't let go. Because do you know what happened in this story? Keep reading. The sea is parted, and they are delivered. That Red Sea that lies before you, that Red Sea that has backed you into a corner, I can't wait to see what God will do.